Stuckey here. Joining me today is my colleague, Mike Calabrese, and he is going to tell us a little bit about his legendary project where he's simulating the greatest college basketball teams of all time. We'll talk about the process. We have a Final Four right now, so we're going to talk about whether or not that Final Four is legit. Did he miss any teams? We'll discuss who we think is going to win it. Should have some fun. Mike, why don't you tell us a little bit about the process, how you came up with the teams, what the simulation is like? Just give us some background.
So first thing, always have to throw in an asterisk next to greatest teams of all time since 1980. And the reason I picked 1980 as kind of a natural cutoff, I think that more or less is the modern era. It was a decade that introduced the three-point shot. You really saw teams move away from holding the ball, in the non-shot clock era. And really you saw things open up throughout the 80s. And, by the early 90s, there are teams that played at a faster pace than some teams today. So I think you get closer to an apples to apples comparison. As for picking this 68 team field, I went through a combination of Sports Reference, their college basketball section. They put together an SRS ranking, which allows you to compare teams from different eras. You can look at teams in their given year, but they also boil it down to one single number. And that certainly helped, probably pick 30 to 40 teams right off the bat. I also wanted to go through the exercise and limit myself to one team per school. Because otherwise you could easily have 5 to 6 Kentucky teams, throw in 3 or 4 teams from Duke and North Carolina each. And then all of a sudden you just don't have room for some of those other iconic teams that maybe don't necessarily deserve to be on the same stage. I'm looking at, Florida Gulf Coast from 2013, but I think it certainly made it a little bit more fun and nostalgia filled to get into, the potential matchups. As for how I ran them through, College Hoops 2K8 was one of the last college basketball video games ever made. And it has a really good simulation engine. And what it allowed me to do to go through and adjust the pace, adjust the efficiency ratings for teams, adjust the officiating, all kinds of these different things that I had to tweak over the process of a few months to be able to start spitting out realistic results. And from there, doing the roster building, it was difficult at times. There was a few classic teams that were already saved in the game, just needed to throw their names on there. But in a lot of cases, I needed to go through, find old school programs in PDF form online, go through, watch some YouTube, make sure that I was matching it as closely as I could. And after that, just firing up the old PS3, she's treated me well over the years. She hasn't crapped out yet. So we're 2 games to go before I can, or 3 games, I should say, before I can close the book on this. So hopefully the PlayStation can last a few more days.
Well, maybe 4. Maybe you got to do a back in the day. They used in the Final Four. They used to have a third place game. So maybe you have to have a third place game to see the third best team of all time. But here's a question: as a guy in Lexington, Kentucky fan, how did you pick between what was the deciding factor that you used to pick between some of these teams that have multiple all-time great teams? So Kentucky 96, obviously in the discussion. They're in the Final Four. Spoiler alert. But, 2015 Kentucky right there, even though they didn't win it all, they lost to Wisconsin after being undefeated in the Final Four. How did you handle that?
For Kentucky at 96, 2012, 2015, you could say that they were all just incredibly close to being selected, and that would be true. It was more or less a coin flip in my mind. And because of that, I kind of turned to the coaching, which would I prefer to have Rick Pitino at the peak of his powers in Lexington or John Calipari. But really it came down to the tendency of the teams. And for my money, the way that Kentucky played basketball, forcing over 20 turnovers per game in 1996, that kind of disruption and difficulty in a tournament setting preparing for is why I went with them. In a lot of ways, it was kind of akin to the college football tournament that I put together 2 years ago that utilized NCAA football 14, the last college football game ever made. In the same way, playing against 95 Nebraska is a reason why they were a 1 seed. It wasn't just the talent on the field, or in this case, the talent on the court, but it was also the novelty of what they were doing. Nebraska with the triple option offense and Kentucky with that full court press, making it very difficult for teams that weren't accustomed to playing against it, or that had 2 or 3, ball handlers who could handle that kind of pressure. That's why I went with 96.
Yeah, I think I would have went 96 too, but it's that, 12, 15, 96. And it's going to be subjective, but I think you made the right choice. Now, we have to remind everyone that we're talking about the best teams of all time. I think the famous coach John Wooden once said there is no greatest team of all time. But I think the beauty of doing this is that we're doing it in a tournament style, right? So it's one and done, right? So the greatest team of all time could lose in the Final Four. So you're bringing kind of the madness of March to this whole process.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to frame this conversation this way because there are so many national champions just in our field, or teams that were special to their individual fan bases, that had historic runs, that put it all together. But as you mentioned, a lot of these teams, they needed to slip by in 2 and 3 point victories on their way to national championships. They also felt the pressure of having to play in that one and done scenario. And we saw it in the South region, 82 North Carolina with James Worthy and Michael Jordan, coached by Dean Smith. They get upset by 2005 Illinois. And that Illinois team was very special in its own right, went to the national championship, was one of the best runner-ups of all time. So throwing that out there, I agree that as opposed to running 10,000 simulations and trying to figure out the average score that they would put up, the average points against, putting it in a one-game scenario certainly had me on the edge of my seat. There were games that I have running in the background that I check in with. Oh, this team's up 15 at halftime. That's fine. There'd be other games where it would come down to the last few minutes where I was pausing my day job and, training my eyes to the TV.
Sam Perkins, I think, was also on that Carolina team, right, too?
Correct. Yes. That was their big three at the time. It was Jordan's freshman year. He was the ACC freshman of the year that season. But James Worthy was the alpha dog there. I think he scored close to 20 points per game for the Tar Heels.
For people that are more, our younger audience that is, more familiar with some of the more recent teams, one of the, from an analytics standpoint, one of the greatest teams of all time is last year's Gonzaga team. You had them as an 8 seed. What happened with them?
So at least according to some of the, multi-generational ranking systems, obviously their offense was super elite, a top 10 offense of all time in terms of efficiency. But when you look at their defense and how they played against some of the other top teams, yes, they had lots of wins, but that Baylor game, I think, at least from my perspective, ended up biasing my seeding a little bit because I felt as though they were exposed in terms of another team being able to put them in a pressure situation and not necessarily seeing them get off the mat and respond. The seeding, really, after the first 1 or 2 seeds, you can make arguments for days. I think that's kind of the beauty of a content project like this. But the way that it matched up in the tournament, for them to catch 91 UNLV in the second round, I believe is the highest estimated total in all of Legendary Madness. It was over 200. I think it was like 201.5 was the total. If I had been, at a sports book in that hypothetical situation, I think I'm playing over all day.
All right, well, let's go region by region. We'll talk about the teams and that have made it through to the Final Four, and then we'll kind of talk about their path and if there was any other teams you were expecting to come out of those particular regions. We'll start in the West, which you just talked about. The 1 seed, 91 UNLV, which 91 UNLV didn't win it all, right?
That is correct. They went undefeated until the Final Four. Yeah.
Yeah, and they've won like 35 straight games. And the interesting thing about UNLV, for my money, I think it's the most talented team that's in the Final Four and maybe ever. Not if you look like NBA careers, it's probably that 82 Carolina team. But that UNLV team was amazing and deep. You had Augman, just the plastic man. You had Greg Anthony at the point, LJ. So this team went on a huge run. Now, the interesting thing, they were 10-point favorites over Duke in the Final Four in the game that they lost. And the refs were awful in that game. I think that was like the start of like Duke and the refs. Greg Anthony, I believe, fouled out with 5 to go on an awful charge call, which kind of changed the complexion of the game. They ended up losing by 2. There's also rumors of that team. If you want to go Google it, I'm not going there, but that the game was fixed. And then UNLV ended up losing it because they got in foul trouble. There was pictures of a lot of the UNLV players in a hot tub with a famous game fixer who was indicted a couple times on bribery charges like a week or 2 after the game with like cigars and smiling. We're not going to go there, but that team was amazing. What was their path? How easily did they run through this region?
So the path is the most interesting argument. We'll get into 2008 Kansas, another team that made the Final Four, because they certainly had an easier path. UNLV, they had to go through some world beaters. So after the first round, they knock off Bryce Drew's Valpo team. Then they get 21 Gonzaga, so a very high scoring game. Then they get 83 Houston. That's Akeem Olajuwon, Clyde Drexler, multiple NBA players on that team. And also they played a similar style. So they were not thrown off by playing that faster pace. The only thing that hurt Houston in that game was Olajuwon got himself into a little bit of foul trouble. And that's something that's interesting in terms of the reaction when I post these recaps online. A lot of people are thrown off by how often foul trouble comes up. I mean, you don't need to really deviate from, last year's March Madness any year that comes up with only 5 fouls, and you can get yourself into real trouble if you pick up too early, have to go to the bench. So they end up getting by 83 Houston. Then
right, these are two teams we're talking about. Like this, the beauty of the tournament again, 5 Slamma Jamma, the UNLV 91, two of the greatest teams of all time. Neither won the national championship, right? One in Houston lost to NC State by 2, UNLV lost by 2, I think, the Duke. That Kentucky team we just talked about, that undefeated Kentucky team lost to Wisconsin in the Final Four, maybe by 2. So really interesting game there. So UNLV advances.
And then they catch the Cinderella of the West region, which was 2008 Memphis. Derrick Rose, but mainly Chris Douglas Roberts. He went absolutely off in this tournament and carried them offensively, and they just ran out of gas against a UNLV team that scored 105 points in the Elite Eight.
Is that what are the that's an interesting question. 08 Memphis, who should have won the national title over 08 Kansas. 08 Memphis. Is 08 Kansas in there too? It was 08 Kansas, right?
Yeah. 2008 Kansas.
08 Kansas. Derrick Rose at the free throw line up 2, and he made like 14, 15, 13 free throws in a row. Missed the first, made the second, and then Chalmers hits that 3 to 4 overtime. Me watching that game, Memphis should have won. We'll get to Kansas later, but is that the only year, or other years have multiple teams?
So just taking a look here, we also have 2004. You had a St. Joe's team sneaks in on the 10 line. 2004 Oklahoma State. They actually played
I knew you had to get that St. Joe's team in there. You as a Hawk.
As a Hawk, I think they are deserving, having run through the regular season perfect, reached number 1, carried that weight, beat a great Chris Paul Wake Forest team in the Sweet 16. So certainly I think they justified their 1 seed. Looking at other teams for multiple years, Baylor having beat 21 Gonzaga, they're the 2 seed in the South. And as more come to me as we run through this, I think there's a few others 2008 Davidson. If we're talking about that year in particular, that's the Steph Curry year.
Kansas beat by 2 in the Elite Eight, I believe. Curry had every shot in that game.
Yeah, they basically went to him on every possession down the stretch.
I think it was 59-57 was the final for Kansas there. But anyway, back to UNLV. So UNLV gets through Houston, and then they get through Memphis to get to the Final Four. So they come out of the West. Let's go to the where's 08 Kansas in the.
They're in the Midwest.
Let's go to the Midwest. We've been talking about 08 Kansas, who, when you think about this team, they had Chalmers and Darrell Arthur underneath. It wasn't the deepest team, but it's a team that just won. And, they found a way to beat Memphis. The star power isn't there as much as other teams, but they're a national champion. 08 Kansas, I believe their path in the actual tournament, like I mentioned, they had a pretty easy path up until the Elite Eight. Then they beat Steph Curry and Davidson. Then they dominated a really good North Carolina team. And then, of course, they beat Memphis in the national title. The 8-9 game that they were going to play is, let's see, Kansas was the 2 seed in the Midwest. Georgetown in 84 was the 1 seed. So tell me about this region, how it played out.
So this brings up one of the reasons why I tweaked the officiating as well as some of the pace numbers. Georgetown wants to play at a slower pace. And I also gave them the benefit. If there was a huge differential in style of play, I give the higher seed the benefit of the doubt. So the sliders would be moved around for fouls. So you saw a rougher, more rugged game. After crushing 2012 Lehigh with CJ McCollum, they end up getting 2007 Ohio State, and that was the Greg Oden team. That was Oden before he had all of his injuries. That was the Thad 5, quote unquote. So that game was a very difficult one in the second round for 84 Georgetown to get by. They win by 1 and then end up getting sniped by the Fab 5, 93 Michigan in the Sweet 16, which ended up clearing the way a little bit for Kansas. They had to get through Chris Webber, Jalen Rose, Jimmy King, etc. in the Elite Eight and avoided Patrick Ewing's 84 Georgetown Hoyas.
Okay, so that Kansas team came out of the Midwest. Their opponent in the Final Four is coming out of the South. The 1 seed, 82 Carolina, we talked about. The 2 seed, 21 Baylor, who we talked about. The 3 seed, 2007 Florida. Really interesting team, because when you first put these out and you were like, who's going to win it all? A lot of people were like, 07 Florida should be higher. '07 Florida is going to win it all. And they were a 3 seed. I think justifiably so. If you look at some of the advanced metrics, and it's not like the advanced metrics didn't love them as much as other teams, but this team was long and scrappy. You had Noah and Brewer, and they just won during their time at Florida. They end up coming out of this bracket. They will face Kansas. We'll talk about that matchup in a little bit, but talk to me about this region.
So their road was difficult. They had to take on the 2011 VCU Rams, who made, their way all the way to the Final Four. Then they catch 95 Wake Forest, which was Randolph Childress as well as Tim Duncan. So having that deep front court, you mentioned it in Noah, Brewer, and Al Horford, that really benefited them against Tim Duncan. Then they go ahead and take care of 21 Baylor. And then just like Kansas, they were the beneficiary of number 1 seed going down. North Carolina trips up against Illinois, and they were able to really coax the only bad offensive game out of the 2005 Fighting Illini. On their run, they were just so dominant. Their backcourt did all the heavy lifting. But in this one, when you look at weaknesses in a head-to-head matchup, Illinois just didn't have the front court to be able to compete. They had Augustine, but that was really it in terms of their front line. So seeing Florida, get there wasn't a big surprise to me. I think if I redid this exercise, I may have moved them up to the 2 line, but I think you're really splitting hairs when you're talking about the 1, 2, or 3 seeds in this tournament.
Don't forget to mention the flamethrower, Lee Humphrey, who was just automatic from 3. Okay, so Florida comes out of the South. They'll take on Kansas, who came out of the Midwest, 2 teams from the same era. But let's go to the East region to find out who 91 UNLV's opponent will be. The 1 seed there, 92 Duke. The 2 seed, 96 Kentucky, we talked about. I think it's close. I think I would have had 96 Kentucky as a 1 seed. Pretty close, but 96 Kentucky prevailed. Extremely deep team. You're talking Antoine Walker, Tony Duck, you go on and on. Nazir Muhammad, who played in the NBA for 2 decades, barely saw the court. This team was deep. They could pressure you. Tino at the helm. I love this team. Tell me how this region played out.
So this region was interesting because you saw 92 Duke, essentially get a red carpet to the Elite 8. They beat Florida Gulf Coast. Then they get a close win over 2015 Wisconsin, which I think was one of the more difficult 8 seeds in the tournament to beat. But then after that, they're the beneficiary of the 12 and 13 seed winning their first round games. So 20 Dayton, who didn't get an opportunity to play in March Madness, they move all the way to the Sweet 16. And that was probably the easiest game for Duke along the way. They end up matching up with 96 Kentucky in what was poetic justice, if there ever was poetic justice. They end up playing at the Wells Fargo Center in Philadelphia, so they get to return to the scene of the Christian Laettner shot in 92, and Christian Laettner called for his 5th foul on a charging call in the final minutes, really put the kibosh on their comeback. Kentucky's able to hold on. They make their foul shots down the stretch, and they punch their ticket to the Final Four.
All right, can't wait to talk about that one, 96 Kentucky versus 91 UNLV. But let's start on the other side on the Final Four to get your thoughts on this matchup. I'll share mine. So you're talking 07 Florida, versus 08 Kansas. Now, here's a very interesting thing. 08 Kansas, who I think if you look back at some of the analytic metrics, like Kansas a little bit more, Kansas actually played Florida, baby Kansas. They were really young the year before in 2007. And they won on a neutral court in overtime, I believe in Vegas. I think there was probably a lot of Kansas fans there, but they won that game in overtime. And this was before Kansas really became what they were. Kansas, a couple days before, struggled to beat someone poorly, and then they almost lost to Oral Roberts, and so they weren't playing well. It was early in the season. They beat that Florida team, defending national champs, ended their game winning streak. It was like a 13-game winning streak, and they weren't fully developed yet. So that could be a piece that you could use to argue, okay, I think this Kansas team is better. What are your thoughts on this matchup? Who do you favor? Who do you think's going to win? Who do you want to win?
I'll say this. There's, some surprising outcomes when I dig through the play-by-play, the box scores. Russell Robinson's 3-point shooting has really carried Kansas because in a lot of cases, he's the 3rd or 4th option on the court. And he's not someone who played a huge role. I don't even think he got to double-digit points per game. But in this particular tournament, as can happen in any March Madness, one player surprisingly gets hot. He's someone who's done it. Florida, on the other hand, I just think they're a more consistent bet because of that front court play. Not only are they going ahead and running their offense through those three bigs in their front court, but also, as you mentioned, they're getting the scrappy plays, they're getting the stocks, the blocks, the steals, the jump ball situations, getting on the floor, and that's reflected in the game. There's all kinds of metrics that they get into. I can't even tell you how many stat and attribute lines there are, but when I watch Joakim Noah play, he looks just like he did in 2007. So I'm going to go ahead with Florida here. I would put them as a short favorite in this spot, even though seeding wise they're a 3 compared to Kansas's 2. And then obviously, as you brought up, this Kansas team had a little bit of an easier road to get here.
Yeah, they got a 12 seed. They got the 12 seed in the actual tournament. They got the 12 seed in the Elite 8, but they got an easier path here as well.
Yeah, so I think that's interesting. I'm not sure how that's going to factor in terms of the actual bracketing. The only thing I can say about College Hoops 2K8 is that it does feel like there's a little momentum game to game. It's saved in one tournament file. So we'll see if Kansas, having not been battle tested quite to the same level that Florida was, if that factors in at all.
All right, I'm going to take the other side. My gut says that Florida wins, but when I first looked at this and then I started breaking it down, Darnell Jackson, by the way, one of the most underrated pieces of that Kansas team. Rush and Chalmers just didn't miss a 3 all year. Humphrey's probably the wild card. If he's just on, he was probably like 46%. All those Chalmers and Humphrey. I wonder who had a higher percentage in that season. They were probably over 45% from 3. I'm going to go with Kansas. They got the win in overtime the year before when they actually played. I'm going to trust Bill Self to get it done. But I think I saw a comment on a reply when you tweeted out the Final Four, someone saying that this is the JV game, the varsity game is the other game. I kind of agree. I think the national title winner of this is going to come out of the other game between 91 UNLV and 96 Kentucky. The difference, I think, will be I think those teams are more talented overall and they're deeper. And like you can turn over that Florida team. I think that's things like that. That's what'll matter. But the depth of those two teams and the talent overall, I think the winner of this wins it all. What are your thoughts on who wins between 91 UNLV and 96 Kentucky?
As I mentioned before, having a front seat to this whole thing as it's unfolding, it's hard not to peg Larry Johnson as the tournament MVP. This guy is just a monster, both in real life and in the video game. He's someone who is dominant inside. He creates second chance opportunities. He can also step out to 3 and hurt you. But the other element of it is that, yes, Kentucky is deeper. They got 9 pros on this team. You mentioned Nazir Muhammad, all these guys who are probably only going to get 4 or 5 minutes. So how much impact does that really have? Over the course of a season, over the course of a tournament, sure. But in a single game scenario, I would rather take really the big 4. I think it goes from Larry Johnson, Plastic Man, Anderson Hunt has been just lethal from 3-point range. And Greg Anthony, if he can, stay out of foul trouble as he struggled with back in 91, if he stays on the court, I think they're going to be able to get by in a high scoring game because for all the benefits that Kentucky can tout when they play that full court press, this is a team that likes to play fast too. So I don't think they're going to be outside of their comfort zone. They're not quite as deep, if anyone does get into foul trouble, and their backup guards like Travis Bice, like players like that are going to be a little bit outside of their depth with, the comparison of like Ron Mercer coming off the bench. But I do think playing 85, 90% of the minutes, the starters from UNLV are just going to sneak by this 96 Kentucky team.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think it'll be a really good game. I think UNLV had like a first-round draft pick center who came off the bench that year. But yeah, their guard depth wasn't great. But I've always said that 91 UNLV team is, for my one, the best of all time. So I'm a Kentucky fan. I'm going to go against my Cats and say UNLV advances. And then I'm going to say UNLV wins it all. You agree?
Yeah, I think this is UNLV's to lose. I think it's going to require really probably foul trouble for Larry Johnson and then kind of an outside of the norm result in terms of their 3-point shooting, or have to go the other way, just like a real college basketball game. If Kentucky buries 15, 16 threes, all of a sudden any benefits are kind of vaporized in that scenario. But whoever wins this, I think they should be significant favorites over 2007 Florida or 2008 Kansas. I think it's probably a worse matchup for Florida because if it's Kentucky having to handle that pressure, yes, they have guards who can, put it in from 35 feet, but can they handle that 90-foot pressure from the Kentucky defense? And similarly for Kansas, I just think there's going to be issues if they do match up against UNLV, doing something defensively with Larry Johnson, because it's that versatility. He's not a back to the basket big who needs set plays. He can take you inside, he can take you outside. I'm not sure there's a defender on their team that can stay with LJ.
Yeah, I think if Florida advances, which we said they'd be a short favorite, that would be the difference, the pressure, because you could turn over that Florida team a little bit. And I think that'll ultimately decide it. Fascinating stuff. It's awesome that you're doing this. Make sure you check Mike's Twitter out at Eastbreeze. That's EASTBREESE. And of course, at Action Network, we'll be featuring this. So we'll have some content on it and let you guys know who ended up winning it all. Debate amongst yourselves. There's probably no right answer. It's a simulation. But I can't wait to see who the winner is. Thanks for doing this, Mike. Thanks for tuning in.
Appreciate it, Stuckey.